All right, in this video, I'm going to talk about the shift in philosophy from existentialism to postmodernism. Um, so, postmodernism describes a variety of different movements in architecture, literature, politics, culture, music, and philosophy. And in many ways, postmodernism is today hegemonic. We find postmodernism everywhere. In pop culture, postmodernism is very common. We see it increasingly in political formulations. Postmodernism is very prominent in architecture and how building styles are utilized in the creation of new spaces in large urban cities. So, what is postmodernism? In this video, I want to focus on two things: a brief overview of what ideas are of postmodernism and how they're related to major material changes in contemporary capitalism, and how postmodernism functions in philosophy and how it changed philosophy from existentialism. And so, first and foremost, what is postmodernism? Broadly speaking, postmodernism as a society, a postmodern social formation, is one in which the mass media and popular culture are far more important than they were in previous social formations, and shape many of our social relations and our sense of identity. Postmodernism emerges with the dominance of things like social media and the way that social media can shape political discussions. So it also involves a situation in which increasingly popular cultural signs and media images dominate our sense of reality, where reality is structured through signs and signifiers, and where one of the major elements is that the sense of identity itself is shattered, where a central reference point in which we can situate ourselves is increasingly undermined and replaced with a multiplicity of identity markers, and in which it becomes increasingly difficult to attach ourselves to one central point of reference, one central signifier. So I'll explain what that means. This is maybe something a little pretentious, and I want to get beyond that in a moment by explaining this. So postmodernism became popular in philosophy in the 1970s. Some of the prominent postmodern philosophers are Michel Foucault, Luce Irigaray, Jacques Derrida, and most importantly, Jean Baudrillard, whose ideas influenced the making of the film The Matrix, which was an earlier stage of postmodernism. But the directors of this film, the Wachowski brothers, were very influenced by Baudrillard's ideas and sought to create a kind of definite postmodern image on the screen. And so in postmodern theory, we tend to see a high emphasis on decentralization. So I want to discuss briefly how this plays itself out in philosophy. So earlier philosophers, maybe could be called what were called modernist. One of the most prominent was Jean-Paul Sartre, right? And so in Sartre's philosophy, the starting point of philosophical engagement is always the subject, the conscious subject. Sartre begins with particular subjects and their situatedness within a definite situation, right? So in his stories, such as No Exit, for example, which is his stage play, we see characters that have been thrown into a very unpleasant and desperate situation, and the story then seeks to explore how they as subjects relate to the situation and what they do to respond. And Sartre places a great deal of emphasis on the particular choices and decisions that they make, and begins from the starting point that there's no right or wrong way to respond to a situation, but that the subject's particular beliefs and past actions play a determinant role in how they decide how to respond. And Sartre began from the starting point that every person, of course, can always change. There's never any kind of required way that one should act. One can always change. There's no final destination or ultimate fate. There's a great emphasis on change because Sartre places a great emphasis on nothingness. Now, this is a theme that we see in postmodernism as well, but postmodernism does something quite different. Postmodernism disrupts the idea of this stable subject. No longer do we see a stable subject that is the reference point for experience. Rather, the subject itself is fragmented and is unable to locate themselves within a particular individual project or a particular belief system. The subject itself is kind of sutured. And one of the philosophers that very much held to this idea was the French theorist Jacques Derrida. And he had this whole philosophy around rejecting totality and emphasizing multiplicity. And we see this idea very prominent in literary theory. His ideas were very influential in literary theory. So in literary theory, traditionally the idea was that if you take a novel, for example, Kafka's Metamorphosis, many of you may have read this book, the idea was that you can read the text and you can locate within it a particular meaning that the author, Kafka, placed in the text. So if you recall, this is the story about a guy, Gregor Samsa, who wakes up to find himself transformed into a bug and a cockroach. And the story then explores how he responds to the situation and his extraordinary alienation from his family and the incredible sense of anxiety that his new transformed situation presents him with. And the idea of traditional literary theory was that Kafka must have had some sense of meaning that he wanted to inject into the story, and the job of the literary theorist was to locate this meaning in order to allow us to have a kind of close relationship between the reader and the author. Right? And postmodernism rejects this. Instead, what it claims is that, number one, every single text contains within it a particular unconscious system that the author kind of steps into, and therefore the author can never be fully conscious of what they themselves meant. So when Kafka wrote the Metamorphosis, he stepped into an unconscious symbolic space, and this symbolic space presented him with different possibilities of how he could combine signs to construct his text, certain cultural images, certain social norms, and certain nationally specific beliefs, certain religious content. And all of these different, what in postmodern theory are called signifiers, come together to construct a kind of textual unconscious that Kafka, the writer, stepped into and himself was unaware, but nonetheless had to assume in order to produce his text. Right? And so postmodern theory, which, as you may have noticed, is also influenced by psychoanalysis, which holds this idea that there is this kind of unconscious stratum in human experience, and holds that thus, um, number one, Kafka himself could never have known what he meant, and number two, there's a multiplicity of different meanings within the text, and no single meaning within the text is primary. Every single particular meaning that we discover is itself undermined by a whole set of other meanings that we may discover in the text. The text itself, therefore, lacks any claims to totality. Right. So in traditional philosophy, in particular, even in Sartre, you see this. The idea was that philosophers create systems, writers create systems, and that system is a well-constructed totality with a sense of order within it, and that the job of philosophy is to try to think philosophically what essential structures can be located within this totality. Philosophy thus was ultimately geared towards totality and towards universality, towards universal claims, universal truths. Postmodernism rejects this. Number one, it claims that the total itself is never total. The whole is never whole. Every discourse is therefore partial, because in every whole, there's a part of the whole that doesn't quite fit in, and that disrupts the entire system and causes it to break down. The totality is always undermined by a singular element that is necessary, but at the same time causes the entire totality to break down. Right? So a literary theorist might read a book like Kafka's Trial or Kafka's Metamorphosis, and instead of trying to understand, well, what did Kafka mean? Instead, the writer will approach it from the standpoint of this singular element that withdraws from the text, that what the French theorist Jacques Lacan called the real, an element within the text that resists symbolization, that can't be fully articulated, but nonetheless has a claim to productivity. It allows the writer to produce something. This singular element is the standpoint from which postmodern theorists begin. Okay, so I want to think a little bit about what is this singular element. So postmodern theory begins from a single thesis, and this is the idea of the primacy of production over meaning. The primacy of production over meaning. Now, what does that mean? Crazy, pretentious language. Okay, what does this mean? Okay, traditionally, philosophy and writers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and phenomenologists such as Edmund Husserl were concerned with the question of meaning. You know, if you study philosophy, one of the first questions someone might ask you is, well, what is the meaning of life? Or what higher meaning is there to one's existence? And other questions arise, such as, how do we produce meaning? You know, we go around the world and we constantly encounter meaning. Meaning in language, right? When you use road signs, for example, to drive a car, you encounter a whole system of meaning. Stop signs, stop lights, road signs telling you to go left or right. You encounter a space of meaning, right? When you go to work, or you go to school, you encounter all sorts of signifiers that are invested with meaning, right? And traditional philosophy places a great emphasis on thinking about meaning. Now, in culture, meaning also traditionally tended to be prevalent and dominant, right? So in traditional films, whether it was a Hitchcock film or James Bond or a big popular Hollywood production or a Disney film, the prevalence of meaning was dominant. One could watch a film and one could ask, what is the story? What is the plot line? Who are the main characters? What is the kind of intended takeaway from the story? This would be a kind of modernist approach to filmmaking. You also tended to see this in, particularly in hip hop, for example, traditional rap music, in people like Tupac and DMX. In the case of Houston, you have people like Scarface, great, brilliant rappers. You know, Tribe Called Quest, who are great lyricists and who have the real great ability to create incredible songs and incredible lyrics, and the real artists. They're poets of the signifier, right? What we find in a song by Tupac, for example, is precisely the presence of meaning. You can locate, for example, the song "Changes," you know, which is calling for a better world, free from oppression, ending racism, poverty, and all the rest of it. You know, Tupac was very concerned with these kind of things in his music. We encounter meaning, though. We encounter this is and this is what drove Tupac to make a lot of his music was meaning. We also encounter, of course, production. There's, of course, in all hip hop historically, there's been a performative element, the element of, you know, doing concerts, making music videos, and there are indeed some rappers like Outkast, for example, who are really good at making really stylish music videos with lots of different effects and very colorful, very using different fashion trends. But still, what we encounter in traditional hip hop is the presence and the dominance of meaning. Right? Now, postmodernism, if we were to use postmodern theory to analyze trends in hip hop, what we would see is a certain movement within hip hop, which began in Houston, Texas, around people like DJ Screw. In the early 2000s, I remember it was very popular with Swisha House. You know, these and what we saw here was something very interesting, very unique. Was a shift from meaning to production. So if you take someone like DJ Screw, and you know what made him brilliant was DJ Screw took up a new style that was present in turntabling and things like this from the 80s, but was not a dominant form in hip hop, and that was the screwed and chopped effect, where you know, DJ Screw was really just experimenting one night while he was DJing, and his battery on his turntable was kind of low, and he discovered that he could keep the battery running longer if he slowed down the music a little bit, or he at least believed this was the case. Okay, and he did it and played a whole set of songs that were popular at the time. I think one of the first songs he experimented with was Ice Cube's "It Was a Good Day," and people loved it. People absolutely loved how the music sounded at a slowed down pace. And so he developed a whole series of kind of effects that were very dominant in Houston, Texas, but quickly spread. And we see the influence dominant in hip hop today. I mean, Drake went to Houston to learn how to make good hip hop music, and that was no mistake. And it was but what I want to focus on here is not get too bound up in the music, but to talk about the philosophical shift that we see in DJ Screw. What was so interesting there was that DJ Screw started releasing in the 90s and in the 2000s screw tapes. They were essentially made on cheap cassette tapes that would be mass distributed from his house in South Houston, and would contain both original content for people like Lil Kiki, Big Mo, Young Star. The very famous song was June 27th. Everyone who likes rap music knows this. And what makes this interesting is what we find in a lot of Houston rappers, although not all, is less of an emphasis on lyricism, on meaning, and a shift to production. Because when you screw the music, you chop it up, you do all sorts of effects to it, what you get is no longer a focus and a centrality on meaning, right? No longer is the listener focused solely on what the lyrics mean. Although we find great lyricists like Youngstar, who was very, very good at creating all sorts of great songs and was a good lyricist. But still, even there, we find every single album that was made in the late 90s in Houston, Texas, was dominated by the screwed and chopped tape. People wanted to get the screwed and chopped version, and people would travel and spend good money to buy this. There was all sorts of legends about how DJ Screw would sell 15,000 screw tapes from his car at a show. And we find thus the shift from meaning to production, right? And this is very much an effect of postmodernism. The late 90s in places like Houston, Texas, were dominated by postmodernism. We get now all sorts of postmodern effects. And what made this interesting was there was a certain democratization that took place within hip-hop music as a result of this. No longer did one necessarily have to be a good rapper. In a lot of cases in Houston rap, the lyrics aren't particularly inventive. Some people might say I wouldn't say mediocre, but they don't necessarily put a whole lot of emphasis into the lyrics a lot of times. Not all. There are many great Houston rappers that still put a lot of art and craft into the lyrics. But a lot of them realized that you could produce still great art if you weren't necessarily a talented lyricist. And this was because production was primary over meaning. And what is interesting is, in Houston, you had this group, the Screwed Up Clique, and it included over 100 members. And there were some very prominent ones, but there were also many people who maybe made one song. Interestingly, George Floyd, who was the well-known victim of the brutal police brutality that occurred last year and sparked huge Black Lives Matter protests, was a member of the Screwed Up Clique and was one of its many participants. So it's very interesting. And what the postmodern effect here did was it thus created a kind of democratization within hip-hop. It allowed anyone who wanted to participate in the production of rap music to do so, which is very much not the case in general in the entertainment industry, which places is very competitive and places a great emphasis on competition, and rightly, and a lot of great rappers were the product of this. People like Jay-Z, who are really good lyricists and know how to construct a good song, were the effect of that. But what's interesting is that this shift from meaning to production, opened up all sorts of new possibilities, and it was the effect of postmodernism. Okay, now that I've laid the kind of foundation of postmodernism, I'll do a little bit more cultural analysis in a moment. I want to focus on the material conditions in society that gave birth to postmodernism in philosophy, in culture, in music. So in the 1970s capitalist social formations, most people still lived in an industrial society. A lot of places around the world, in the Western capitalist countries, such as the United States, Britain, Germany, this was still West Germany at the time, and the Netherlands, France, still had a fairly large industrial sector. Most working people were employed in factories, and many people had very stable jobs. People could get out of secondary school, out of high school, and go seek a job. And a lot of people had lifelong jobs. There were strong unions. Workers still had fairly strong bargaining power. And there were major workers' uprisings around the world between the 60s and the early 80s as a result of this. This was often called the golden age of labor, where the working class still had significant bargaining power. Workers could go on strike or even threaten a strike and make significant concessions from their employers, right? And so modernist culture was very much an effect of the early stage of capitalism and also its later monopoly stage, where you saw large centralized corporations and the industrial sector was dominant, and where people, but nonetheless, still had fairly stable jobs, right? And so what happened in the 1980s because working people had such significant power and influence in society, um, the capitalist class started realizing if it wanted to continue making profits, it was going to have to disrupt this stability that working people had. And you saw this with politicians like Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and they started developing a new ideology within capitalism called neoliberalism, right? And what neoliberalism essentially did was it first and foremost deindustrialized many of the Western capitalist states and transformed them into large service sectors. And the primary form of employment for people became the service sector. So the service sector includes, on the one hand, jobs like working as a cleaner or working in a shop to sell to like a fashion store like H&M. In the subcategory of the service sector, retail employment, working at Starbucks, working as a train conductor or a bus conductor. For many working people, this is the job that people have today, is in the service sector. On the other hand, it also includes things like marketing, office employment, working in administration, working in tourism. All of this is the service sector. And the primary form of employment for working people in the era of neoliberalism is the service sector. Now, I've recently published a book called Service Workers in the Era of Monopoly Capital, where I look at these shifts in modern capitalism and how it changed the composition of the working class. I approached it from a Marxist standpoint and demonstrated how Marxist theory could help us to understand these shifts. So that was, you should read the book. It's available with Brill and Brill Publishing. It will also be available as a paperback next year with Haymarket Books. Okay, but I want to return now to the main topic. So neoliberalism thus deindustrialized Western societies. Now, it doesn't mean that the industrial sector was no longer dominant. It was shifted geographically to a different part of the world. Most of the industrial production that was traditionally conducted in the large capitalist centers in the United States, in Britain, in the European Union, in Japan, was shifted to the peripheries of global capitalism and the lower income countries. So think of, for example, Bangladesh. Bangladesh, Cambodia, China, India, these four countries are the main producers of clothing in the world. Many of the factories that produce a lot of the clothing we wear, that we buy in shops such as H&M or the Gap, was produced in a factory in a place like Bangladesh. And so now it's not true. It's still true that in some capitalist countries, manufacturing and large-scale industrial employment is still prominent, and it does still provide stability for working people. For example, Italy and Germany still have a huge automobile industry. But this is all gone in other parts of the world. In the United States, in Detroit, for example, in the 90s, a lot of the auto factories of GM and Ford were shut down, and production was shifted to places like Mexico. So it resulted in a deindustrialization, right? And so this gave birth to this large service sector. In the earlier stage, the service sector did provide a high income and higher skilled employment for many working people. Many people got jobs in offices of large corporations where they worked as marketers, product developers, administrators, and this did provide higher employment for people, and for a period at least provided stability for many people. But in the 90s, all this stability started to break down, and the stability of life for many people was disrupted. And at the end of the 90s and going into the 2000s and going into contemporary times, many people today go to university and get a degree, whether it's in the humanities or the sciences or the technical jobs or an occupation of some sort. all of these uh, forms of employment no longer provide a job guarantee. Many people around the world, many working people, go through incredible hurdles to get a stable job. The idea of a career with a permanent job contract, full-time employment, benefits, a trade union, is for many people a thing of the past. There's still some sectors, especially in government employment, that this is still the case, but for many people this is no longer a fact of life. And so this gave these neoliberal transformations, right, gave birth to a situation where many people work multiple jobs on temporary job contracts. In the UK, a lot of people are on what are called zero-hour contracts. A zero-hour contract is a type of job contract where you get a job, but there's no guarantee that you're actually going to have work hours. Rather, it's called flexible employment. And flexibilization means that you always have to be ready for work. You always have to be prepared to show up. And you therefore are constantly in an insecure situation. In higher education, a lot of teachers, including myself, work as adjunct professors. And adjuncting means that often you have to teach between 6 and 9 courses at multiple institutions just to make ends meet, at a much lower wage than the traditional tenure-track professor would have made. And there have been some efforts in higher education to organize adjunct professors, but for the most part, adjuncts live often very difficult lives. Recently, there was a story in The Guardian of what is called temporary lecturer. It's the UK equivalent of an adjunct professor, who was living in a tent. She had a PhD, and she was a graduate. She was either a graduate student or already had her PhD, but she was working as an adjunct professor, and she was living in a tent because she couldn't afford the rent, she couldn't afford the bills, and she kept this from her family. And she would keep all of her books in her office, and kept this from everyone. But suddenly, it came out that this happened, and that this was an effect of the employment situation, because the university didn't want to give her a permanent job. So these are the effects of neoliberalism. Instability, the breakdown of a central point of reference. For the contemporary working person, one's identity can be often located in a multiplicity of different spaces, none of which provide a stable career. And in many cases, a lot of people have to do multiple jobs that they don't enjoy, and often jobs that they would rather not do, losing out on the actual thing that they wanted out of life. Right? So we see this expressed in culture, and it is indeed, as I said, a shift from meaning to production. In the contemporary neoliberal society, many of us find it hard to find a great deep meaning in our life. The idea of some deep meaning is, for many people, a myth that is best avoided. But what is indeed the case is many of us do find a kind of precarious short-term existence, but one in which, at least occasionally, we can produce something of which we're proud, and in which we may take pride. And I want to examine briefly another more recent interesting transformation in popular postmodern culture, and that is in K-pop. And now K-pop, started in the very late '90s, but really kind of took off in the 2010s, and around the world today is really popular with people like BTS and Blackpink. My personal favorite is a group that I recently discovered called SHINee. The most famous member of which are Taemin, who's gone off and become a kind of solo artist. Now, what is very, very interesting about SHINee is they are very much the product of neoliberal culture, right? So they were hired at the end of the 2000s to work for this company called SM Entertainment in Korea. And this company literally hired them, 5 guys, and put them together to create a K-pop group. and they're very, very talented and became very, very popular quickly in Korea, um, and are very popular around the world. They have loads of fans on social media, and around the world they gather. And now, what's interesting about Shiny? Shiny is very much, as I said, the product of neoliberal culture. One finds in all of their different music videos, and constantly throughout their period, they started around 2009 and are still continuing. They've just released their seventh album, which has been released, double release, Don't Call Me and Atlantis. These are their two most recent albums. And what is so interesting about them is one finds exactly what one would find in a neoliberal society. Constantly they're reinventing themselves. Not one of their videos is the same. They constantly change their appearance. The same Taemin that one may have found 10 years ago is no longer the same one finds today. They're changing their personality, their way of expressing themselves. Their videos are very visually stimulating and interesting. And what one finds is that in their music, really, the meaning of what they're singing about is not particularly always important. Occasionally the lyrics are interesting, but a lot of it has to do with how they sing or how they perform. There's a very deep performative element. And so what we find in the music of Shiny and Taemin are precisely this situation we find in neoliberal social formation. A multiplicity of elements in which no single element is dominant, but in which all the elements can come together to create a kind of product, and in which production takes prevalence over meaning. And in the case of Shiny, what is so interesting about Shiny is they represent a kind of resistance to neoliberalism imminent to the social formation of neoliberal society. We find there certain practices and behaviors that are inherently incompatible with neoliberalism. Because what the ideology of neoliberalism tells us is that one should work hard, one should try to have a career, one should be flexible, one should be very enthusiastic, one should smile at all times and be cheerful. These are the kind of demands coming from the neoliberal social formation, and we see this to some extent performed in the music of Shiny, but in a way that to some extent is disruptive and almost kind of mocks them. In fact, you can look on YouTube and find all sorts of videos of the members of Shiny kind of mocking the management team that creates them and constantly polices them. You know, it's very sad that one of the members of Shiny, Jong-yoon, who he committed suicide because he was so overworked and so stressed and so frustrated. It's a very sad situation. They began with 5, and there's only 4 of them left today. He is the victim of the neoliberal ideology, which is dominant in South Korea, but is also dominant around the world in which many of us live in. But what I want to emphasize is, again, in the music of them we find the prevalence of production over meaning, right? And this gives them to some extent a certain level of freedom, but it also it allows them to experiment with the multiplicity of styles rather than confining them to one. Okay, so this is thus what we find in postmodernism, and is a way in which it's very different from existentialism. Postmodernism, as I thus conclude, rejects the idea of totality. It emphasizes the decentralization of the subject. The subject is fragmented. A person or an individual no longer locates themselves within a single reference point, but is rather scattered, fragmented, across a multiplicity of different identity markers, unable to locate themselves within any particular space, but as a result, constantly kind of floating in a kind of fluid space. And on the one hand, this can be very depressing for many people, very difficult, can cause higher levels of anxiety, but on the other hand, does create new social forms which I think is important to acknowledge. These new social forms have been embraced by the group Shiny and by Taemin, and probably by a whole host of other K-pop artists, but I'm not going to speak too much because I don't proclaim to be a K-pop fan or know loads about K-pop, but I like Shiny. Um, so and but you see artists like Shiny embracing these elements and trying to do something creative with it, right? And I think this is also important to think about in terms of how we organize ourselves as people. You know, in my new book, Service Workers in the Era of Monopoly Capital, I discuss this in great detail and argue that although neoliberal society is very difficult for many people to live in, there are new opportunities for us to organize. And by us, I mean people who are involved in progressive political activism, trade unionism, and different movements of the people. And that the traditional ideas of how we think about political organization need to be seriously called in question and adapted to the particular movements. And that doesn't just mean going out, you know, and protesting and standing in the streets with a sign and, you know, enough is enough. That's maybe an important form of social protest, but to also locate forms of protest within culture, within particular sites of labor that wouldn't have traditionally been organized by trade unions. Take, for example, Starbucks workers. Traditionally, Starbucks workers would not have been organized by trade unionists. They would have largely ignored it. But today, Starbucks workers, you know, many of us go to Starbucks. We drink Starbucks coffee or have a frappuccino or whatnot. We have our morning time there. We meet friends there. I see no problem with this. Many of us go there, right? But the important thing is we, as consumers there, have a direct relation to the Starbucks worker. And there is a new relationship between the service worker and the consumer that calls for a worker-consumer alliance that may not have been prevalent in previous forms of labor organization. You know, in the past, workers went to work in a factory and they were all united together. You know, there was great worker solidarity, and in society there was often solidarity geared towards workers. But the workers that produced and manufactured products were often very separated from the consumers. This is not the case in the service industry. It's also not the case in the music industry. You know, if you look at K-pop fans, for example, which I've been reading up about as I've recently discovered Shiny, are very, very into the K-pop idol that they like. BTS has a particular category for this called their army, and they call their fans a soldier. These are people that are really, really committed to this music star that they identify with. I think this is something that should be taken seriously, not just ignored, but actually seen as a potential site for political organization and social transformation that could be directed towards progressive aims of all sorts, and philosophical theorizing that has to be approached. I don't like philosophers who just reject pop culture and create some artificial kind of binary. You know, traditionally philosophers held this chauvinistic idea that on the one hand you had low culture here and you had high culture here. I don't think this is how we should think about culture or art. There's one culture, there's one form of art, and all of it contains different potentialities for creativity, for social theory, for philosophical inquiry. Rap and hip-hop, K-pop are just as important as classical music, traditional theater. All of these places open up different spaces for theorizing and social transformation. And indeed, in the United States, there have been many recent examples of this. You know, if you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, interestingly, what you'll find are many, for example, football players who have shown their solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement. You know, at the beginning of the game, Beyonce at the Super Bowl, you know, did her famous song. I can't remember the title. I like Beyonce, but I'm not a Beyonce fan. I was more interested in them when they were Destiny's Child. But this was an example of a kind of solidarity between the cultural movements and the people's movements on the ground. So you see this expressed in a variety of ways. Okay, at this point I'm somewhat rambling, and so to return to postmodernism, these are the main elements of postmodern philosophy. Yes, I hope this video was helpful.